In the 1920s, flying was so dangerous that few people took to the skies. Then plane builders, pilots, and buccaneer businessmen began transforming flight. Amid scandal and catastrophe, travelers started crossing continents and oceans in the air, changing the world forever.
Chasing the Sun was made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of the men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit. The Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
In 1928, a French pilot and adventurer named Antoine de Saint-Exupéry was flying the mail between remote settlements in the Sahara Desert. He was traversing an inhospitable land in a notoriously unreliable World War I surplus plane. And yet, he could not have loved his job more.
Alone, before the tempestuous skies, the pilot defends his mails. They constitute the dogma of his religion, of his craft. The torch which in this aerial race is passed from runner to runner.
The intoxicating experience of soaring day after day across the Sahara inspired Saint-Exupéry to spend his nights writing about his love affair with flying.
A pilot's business is with the wind, with the sand, with the stars. He strives to outwit the forces of nature. He looks forward to port as to a promised land. And truth for him is what lives in the stars.
For Saint-Exupéry, it was a grand adventure. It was also extremely dangerous. On one trip across the Sahara, Saint-Exupéry's plane suddenly developed engine trouble. He had to make an emergency landing hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement. Far from despairing, Saint-Exupéry decided to take the opportunity to survey his surroundings.
I walked to the top of a sand hill and looked around the horizon like a captain on his bridge. This sea of sand bowled me over. Unquestionably, it was filled with mystery and danger. I sat still and stared into space. The Something half revealed yet wholly unknown had bewitched me. The love of the Sahara, like love itself, is born of a face perceived and never really seen.
When a rescue plane finally located him, Saint-Exupéry's engine was repaired, and he continued with his mission. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry was a man who faced extraordinary difficulties and triumphed over them. In the late 1920s, there were many others like him, and together they would shape the future of flight. In the early days of flight, those drawn to the quest to build a better plane combined equal parts creativity and daring.
Everything was possible, and therefore the sort of people who were attracted to aircraft construction were not so much technicians or the sorts of engineers we think of today as designing airplanes. They were dreamers. They were people with imagination. They were people with unlimited faith in their own abilities. They were people who were willing to pursue their dreams wherever they led them.
One of the few would-be designers who did have an engineering background was Donald Douglas. At 23, he graduated from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology as one of the first aeronautical engineers in America. For 6 years, Douglas worked for aircraft manufacturers in the East. Then, at 28, he decided to throw caution to the wind and start his own company. And he was convinced that the West Coast, where the weather made flying possible year-round, was the perfect place to do it. Once he'd moved to Los Angeles, Douglas began desperately searching for a job that would get his company off the ground. Then he met a wealthy playboy named David Davis, who was in the market for a plane in which he could make front-page news by becoming the first to fly non-stop across the U.S. To win the contract, Douglas went back to his tiny shop and drew up plans for a plane called the Cloudster, which would be big enough and strong enough to carry all the fuel the trip would take. When Davis saw the plans, he agreed to finance the project. Suddenly in need of help, Douglas carefully crafted a letter to his best friends back east, trying to convince them to quit their jobs and come west to join his new company.
Greetings, old tops. I am started on a small job. I cannot pay big money, and it'll be hard work for everyone. But I can assure you that those that will go through it with me will share at the table if anything comes of it in a bigger way. Best in the world to you, Don.
The letter had the desired effect. 4 of Douglas' friends quit their jobs and came to Los Angeles. But when the group arrived at Douglas' address on Pico Boulevard, they found a barber shop. The men were in shock. After the address was confirmed, one of them, George Strompel, ventured warily inside.
Wonder which chair Don has. If he bought the shop, he might have the first chair. A nice setup. We come all the way from Cleveland, and to what? A barber shop?
Douglas emerged from his office in back and greeted his friends. At that moment, the ground shook, and a violent earthquake struck Los Angeles. After the dust settled, the Easterners were less than enthusiastic about the West Coast. But they were still thrilled about the chance to build a new kind of plane. As soon as the plane was completed, David Davis attempted his cross-country flight. Unfortunately, engine trouble forced him down in Texas. Douglas and his men were disappointed, but they still believed that the Cloudster was special, the first plane able to carry a payload equal to its own weight. As luck would have it, the military was also impressed by the Cloudster, and soon Douglas and his friends were building planes for the Army. Douglas Aircraft was off and running. But Douglas wasn't the only one trying to build a better plane. The Lockheed brothers of Santa Barbara, California, thought they had one in 1918. But due to a glut of World War I planes on the market, they couldn't sell it, and the brothers went bankrupt. In 1927, they made a comeback. This time, the company hired the young whiz kid Jack K. Northrop as their designer. Northrop came up with the Vega, the most aerodynamically advanced plane of its day. Amelia Earhart flew the Vega across the Atlantic, and Wiley Post took it around the world. With such priceless free publicity, the company was able to sell the Vega in droves to airmail carriers. Lockheed was now an established player in the airplane building game. Up in Seattle, Washington, a wealthy young bachelor named William Boeing caught the flying bug. After piloting a seaplane for the first time, Boeing declared, "I think we can build a better one." And he did. His Seattle boatyard was soon turning out planes for the military. But Boeing's chief test pilot, Eddie Hubbard, had an even better idea. He suggested that the company use its own planes to start Boeing Airlines, which could compete for the lucrative airmail contracts. Boeing's first contract was to carry the U.S. mail from Seattle to Vancouver Island, where it could be put on ships for the Orient. Boeing Airlines would soon change its name to United. In 1930, United was just one of dozens of tiny domestic airlines that were competing with each other to win mail contracts. With the competition so fierce, nobody was getting rich. But in New York, one man had his eye on a new market he believed could make him rich: flying outside the U.S. As a young man, Juan Trippe hated his first name because it made people think he was Spanish when he was in fact from a wealthy family of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. He asked people to call him Terry instead. After he graduated from Yale, Terry Trippe went to work on Wall Street and found it supremely boring. What excited Trippe was airplanes. He began to dream of an airline headquartered in New York City that would fly exclusively to foreign destinations. At 28, bankrolled by his own inheritance and that of his rich friends, Trippe opened the offices of Pan American Airways.
We are going in for the foreign business entirely. That's where the biggest opportunity lies. Think what it would mean to the businessmen of this country if they had airmail service to the West Indies, Mexico, and South America. Within 5 years, Pan American Airways ought to be the most important airline in the world.
An early employee described Pan Am as being put together by rich men with a feeling in the seat of their pants for flying. But Terry Trippe had more than just a feeling for flying. He was also a first-class salesman, as one prospective recruit to his new airline recalled.
He took me out to lunch in 27. After listening to him, I threw up a job that could have been mine for life and joined his harebrained airline. When I got home, I was ashamed to tell my wife.
Even more important than his salesmanship were Tripp's contacts. Through his wealthy Yale roommate, Tripp had a line to Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury. Mellon fixed it so that Pan Am was awarded the first U.S. government airmail routes to the Caribbean. Figuring he'd get better deals if the natives thought he was Spanish, Tripp started using his given name, Juan. The well-known magazine writer and pilot, Ernest K. Gann, was amazed at the tactics Juan Tripp used as he went about winning route after route.
Seen in his office high in Manhattan's Chrysler Building, he might impress the casual visitor as a nice Ivy League boy who's found something to do. He was Juan Terry Tripp, sometimes known as Juan Napoleon, whose major sport was hunting and capturing air routes throughout the world. He entertained the notion that he and his airline were ordained with a divine right to do all of his nation's overseas flying.
Tripp's bid to dominate the overseas routes gained an enormous boost when he succeeded in convincing the most famous aviator in the world, Charles Lindbergh, to come to work for his airline. Lindbergh saw in Tripp a kindred spirit, even if he knew Tripp was a bit of an operator.
Juan Tripp was an extremely colorful character, bigger-than-life personality. He was reputed to be a bit of a buccaneer in business. And Charles Lindbergh knew that. But at the same time, I think Lindbergh believed that Juan Tripp was a visionary. And he and Juan Tripp shared the same vision, and that is that aviation could change life for the better.
In September 1929, Pan Am extended airmail flights from Cuba across the Caribbean, all the way to South America. To publicize the event, Juan Tripp, his wife Betty, and newlyweds Charles and Anne Morrow Lindbergh went on the inaugural flight. With Charles Lindbergh at the controls, they took off in a revolutionary new plane, the Sikorsky S-38 flying boat. As they island hopped through the Caribbean, the Tripps and Lindberghs were among the first tourists ever to arrive by air. Both Tripp and Lindbergh believed that it was the dawn of a marvelous new era for the people of the Caribbean. But Anne Morrow Lindbergh wasn't so sure. She wrote of her doubts in her diary.
I am rather worried about these islands. I like them because they are as untouched as Nassau used to be. This airline is bringing to them the fate of Nassau. Tourists, drugstores, hotels, but also prosperity, education, sanitation. Why do progress and beauty have to be so opposed?
But for Juan Tripp, there were no such doubts. To him, what was good for Pan Am was good for America and the world. And the United States government seemed to agree. In 1931, the Postmaster General awarded Tripp a monopoly over airmail rights south of the United States. But as it turned out, Pan Am wasn't the only airline that was getting rich on a sweetheart deal with the government. In 1933, an historic shift in power took place in Washington. Herbert Hoover's Republicans were out. Franklin Roosevelt's Democrats were in. And they were convinced that the Republicans had been making illegal deals with big business. Senator Hugo Black of Alabama was appointed to investigate the airline industry, where United, TWA, American, and Eastern had suddenly and mysteriously been awarded almost all of the nation's domestic airmail contracts. When Black subpoenaed the records kept by the airlines, his aides discovered 300 bags of torn-up papers. When pieced together, the papers detailed a remarkable series of meetings 4 years earlier, at which the major airlines divvied up America. Back in 1930, the Republican Postmaster General Walter Folger Brown had summoned many of the nation's airline executives to secret meetings in Washington. To bring a chaotic, cutthroat industry under control, Brown demanded that the men pick 4 airlines from among themselves. Those 4 would divide up the country. Everybody else would have to sell out. One man who attended the conference was L.H. Britton, Vice President of Northwest Airlines.
The airmail executives are having a terrible time in Washington. Postmaster General Brown has decided, probably unfairly, a plan for just a few transcontinental routes. He called us together, handed us this map, and instructed us to settle the distribution of these routes. We've been meeting every day for 2 weeks and have arrived nowhere. Brown meets with us about once a week, stirs us up, and keeps us going.
Walter Folger Brown was afraid that smaller carriers, who perhaps really weren't up to the job, who wouldn't sort of fill a particular route niche, geographic niche very effectively or efficiently, would underbid the big guys just to get the contract. So he really wanted to pick the strong potential carriers and support them.
The meetings went on for weeks, with the airlines unable to agree on who would get which piece of the pie. Finally, Brown imposed a solution. He forced 15 small airlines to sell out. Then he gave United the northern U.S., with a hub in Chicago. TWA got the central routes and a hub in St. Louis. American was given the South, with a hub in Dallas, and Eastern got the Eastern Corridor, with a hub in New York. When the scheme was uncovered 4 years later, the Roosevelt administration was outraged.
The reaction to the Spoils Conference early in the Roosevelt administration was shock and surprise that the Hoover administration would attempt to manipulate an industry, a couple of industries, in fact, manufacturing as well as operations, as well as airlines.
These contracts, every requirement of law was observed.
A defiant Brown responded that he had only acted for the good of the nation. But the Democrats did not believe that monopolies were in the public interest.
We cannot build up an aviation industry upon a rotten foundation.
With the stroke of a pen, the president canceled all government contracts with the Big Four airlines. Then he ordered the Army Air Corps to take over airmail delivery. But he only gave the Air Corps 10 days to gear up in the midst of the worst winter in years. Charles Lindbergh was one of those who foresaw disaster.
He was genuinely concerned about the safety. Lindbergh, having been both an Army pilot and an airmail pilot, believed those were two different states of mind. He believed Army pilots flew with a kind of sense of mission, that you had to complete the mission no matter what the dangers. He warned the government. He said these Army pilots will not get through. And he kept saying they are going to chance it sometimes when they shouldn't do it.
Lindbergh was right. 3 Army flyers died while in training. 3 more died in the first week of service. 12 died within a month.
One by one, these Army pilots began to go down, and it literally took a dozen of them before the public became absolutely outraged.
In an ironic twist, it was suddenly Roosevelt who the public considered the villain in the airmail scandal. To cut his losses, the president decided that the government should get out of the airmail business and give it back to private industry.
People have speculated that this was a really critical moment in the history of American aviation, because this is the period when European nations like France, for example, are nationalizing. And the American industry could have headed in the same direction, but this seemed to put a stop to that kind of thinking.
But Roosevelt did make changes. With the Airmail Act of 1934, open bidding was restored. In addition, the great holding companies like Boeing that controlled both manufacturing and airlines were broken up. It was a law with enormous consequences. With their lucrative monopolies flying the mail gone, if the airlines were going to grow, they would have to expand in an entirely different market: flying passengers. In April of 1932, a TWA flight took off from Kansas, bound for Los Angeles. It was a typical airline flight of the time, with 6 passengers squeezed in among the mailbags. One of the passengers was Newt Rockne, the famous football coach at Notre Dame. Rockne was one of the few Americans who was both wealthy and adventurous enough to risk flying. Suddenly, an hour into the flight, one of the plane's wings broke off. Inspections revealed that the plane's wooden wings were filled with dry rot. The death of Newt Rockne was front-page news across the country. For countless Americans, the tragedy confirmed what they'd already suspected. Planes might well be faster, but people lived longer if they took the train. In the aftermath of the crash, TWA President Jack Fry was under enormous pressure to find a better, safer plane. He sent letters to the top manufacturers asking for their best ideas. One of the letters landed on the desk of Donald Douglas, who described it as the birth certificate of the modern airliner. Douglas Aircraft won the TWA contract with a proposal for an all-aluminum plane, which would be fitted with 2 of the most powerful engines ever built. The plane could fly 170 miles an hour and cross the United States in 13 hours. It would be like nothing the world had seen before. To design and build such a plane would be a tremendous challenge. But the very boldness of it was what inspired the Douglas team.
Douglas was getting so far ahead of anybody else that had manufactured airplanes when I joined them that every day I went to work, I was learning something new every day. I could hardly wait to get to work. In fact, if I hadn't had a family to support, I think I would work for nothing. It was so exciting to do.
The first version of Douglas' modern airliner could comfortably seat 12 passengers. The plane's metal wings were ingeniously designed to be lightweight, yet incredibly strong. The one doubt that remained was whether the plane's engines were powerful enough to meet TWA's stringent safety requirements. Charles Lindbergh, had advised TWA not to buy the plane unless Douglas proved that it was so safe it could lose an engine and still fly over the Rocky Mountains. In November of 1933, the new plane was ready to face the challenge. It would attempt to take off from Winslow, Arizona on one engine, clear 6,500 feet of mountain, and fly to Albuquerque. Chief designer Art Raymond told Douglas that he was 90% sure the new plane could do it. But, Raymond added, the other 10% is keeping me awake nights. For this test, everyone agreed that it would be safer not to turn off the second engine, but keep it idling. If the plane faltered on takeoff, Douglas aircraft pilot Eddie Allen could immediately rev the second engine and avert a crash. Sitting next to Allen was Tommy Tomlinson, TWA's official observer. Frank Colbohm of Douglas stood behind him. He described what happened as the plane roared down the runway.
The plane started down the runway, eating concrete like a drag racer on the highway. She used up 3/4 of the runway before I felt the landing struts lift. Then it happened. Tomlinson of TWA reached out and turned off the right engine. Allen, taken by surprise, jammed forward hard on the throttles. The plane shook and staggered. Allen glanced at Tomlinson with a, "What the hell did you do that for?" kind of look in his eye. Tommy answered, "It's this way. You work for the manufacturer. I work for the customer. I just want to see if the old girl is as good as you guys claim she is."
The old girl was good. On one engine, the plane slowly rose above the runway, then above the mountains. The modern airliner had made a stunning debut. TWA immediately ordered 20 of the planes. It was the beginning of a golden age for Douglas aircraft. Next, the company built an even bigger, more advanced plane with optional sleeping berths. It was called the DC-3. The height of luxury, the DC-3 Douglas Sleeper Transport had roomy seating, steam heat, 14 sleeping berths, and men and women's lavatories. The DC-3 transformed the experience of flying.
What was different about the DC-3 is that when you actually got on the airplane and it settled into your seat, you could do something that would have been unimaginable in the 1920s. You could forget that you were on an aircraft. You would have been able to relax. Looking out the window, one would be overwhelmed by the grandiosity of the spectacle. And I think also one would enjoy a certain feeling of pride at having had the courage to decide to travel by air. And this became extremely attractive to people and began to encourage people to fly, particularly when you add to this the advantages that aircraft could offer in terms of saving time.
For the crew, in addition to hydraulic landing gear and wing flaps, the DC-3 was the first plane to have autopilot.
I'd never flown such a stable airplane. Everything else you had to keep flying all the time. But here was a DC-3 that was sitting there, and you could just sit there, all the pilots would almost sit there without touching the controls.
The fastest passenger plane of its size, This sleek silver bird was soon being flown by airlines around the world. Even more important, the DC-3 made history as the first plane to make money carrying only passengers. The era of widespread passenger flight was underway. In his office, high above Manhattan, Juan Trippe was legendary for personally mapping out new Pan Am routes with a piece of string and his huge office globe. In 1934, Trippe made a bold announcement. Pan Am is going to conquer the Pacific. Flying an airliner across the Pacific was thought to be impossible, since there was nowhere to land and refuel in the vast stretch of open ocean between America and China. But his experience island hopping in the Caribbean had convinced Trippe he could do it. Taking into account the 2,400-mile range of his new fleet of flying boats, he set out to find a series of strategically positioned islands at which they could land. And the only stretch where he couldn't find an island was the nearly 3,000 miles between Midway and Guam. So the ever-resourceful Trippe unearthed a set of 18th century ship's logs, and there he found a report of a volcanic atoll that might work, a tiny speck in the ocean called Wake Island. With this ace in the hole, Trippe went to the office of the Postmaster General with a proposition. If Pan Am found a way to cross the Pacific, it would be guaranteed all of the airmail contracts to the Far East. Surprisingly, the Roosevelt administration agreed to this monopoly. They reasoned that it was in the national interest to allow Pan Am to do what it had done in the Caribbean, blaze a path behind which American business and the American military could follow.
They really saw Pan Am as the American chosen instrument that would carry the expansion of American power, air power, into those parts of the world. So Pan Am was in a special, unique position among American airlines during those years.
Trippe now knew that if he succeeded, his payoff would be a fabulously valuable monopoly. And so he decided to take the biggest gamble of his life. He spent millions to outfit a ship that would sail to Wake Island, a tiny volcanic atoll that he knew almost nothing about, and build an airport. In March of 1935, the North Haven steamed from San Francisco, headed for Wake Island. Ever the salesman, Trippe had managed to talk William Gruch into overseeing the expedition.
Supposedly, all we had to do was pile our materials on the ship, send the ship to the island, unload the cargo, and hire a local contractor to construct a station. It wasn't a bit like that. Wake Island turned out to be a uniquely difficult place to build an airport. It is entirely surrounded by coral reefs, and the ship had to unload her cargo in the open sea. There are no local contractors, no workmen. The newspapers dubbed the expedition the modern Robinson Crusoes. But Crusoe picked a better island than we did. At least he had fresh water and fruit.
But Gruch knew that Juan Trippe and Pan Am could not afford for him to fail. And so he and his men set to work. Over the course of 9 lonely months, they transformed the 3-square-mile island from an almost barren, uninhabited wasteland into a bustling town with streets, dock, and seaport. Then Tripp sent out another ship loaded with an entire prefab hotel. Tripp built identical facilities on the islands of Midway and Guam. After 18 months of effort, the historic day was at hand. On October 13th, 1936, the first flight to China was ready to take off from San Francisco with a full load of mail and passengers. Once in the air, the China Clipper sailed past the partially completed Golden Gate Bridge. 2,400 miles later, it touched down in Hawaii. The plane also stopped to refuel at the elaborate new Pan American facilities in Midway, Wake, Guam, and the Philippines. After 8,000 miles, the plane finally arrived in Hong Kong, the last frontier. A reporter for the Hong Kong Post was in the anxiously awaiting crowd.
Over 4,000 persons witnessed one of the most momentous events in the history of aviation. As the 23-ton plane came gracefully to a stop, the dream of aviators, businessmen, and travelers for many years was realized.
One Tripp's gamble had paid off for Pan Am. In the years ahead, the gamble would also pay off for Boeing when Tripp upgraded his Pacific fleet to the Boeing 314. The Yankee, Dixie, and Honolulu Clippers would be the most luxurious airplanes ever built. Carrying 74 passengers, the Clippers had 40 sleeping cabins, a dining room, lounge, galley, bar, plus men's and women's dressing rooms. The tail of the plane could be converted into a deluxe bridal suite. With planes like the B-314 filling the skies, the airlines were convinced that more and more people would start flying. The problem was that, for many, there was still a catch. In 1935, airlines in the U.S. carried a total of 52,000 passengers. Trains in the U.S. carried a total of 700 million passengers. One reason for the enormous discrepancy was that most train travelers still considered flying too risky. And every time they heard about another plane crash, their fears were yet again confirmed. To win people away from the train, the airlines needed to change the very psychology of the public toward flying. And since the vast majority of travelers were men, it was their attitude toward flying in particular that needed changing. It was a woman who figured out how. In 1934, Ellen Church went to United Airlines and suggested that they put young nurses on board their planes to care for their frightened and airsick passengers. United Airlines executive Steve Stimson, who knew a great idea when he heard one, immediately sent a memo to his boss.
It strikes me that there would be great psychological punch to having young women stewardesses, or whatever you wanted to call them. The average graduate nurse is a girl with some horse sense and is very practical. I am certain that there are some mighty good ones available. And imagine the psychology of having young women as regular members of the crew. Imagine the national publicity we could get from it, and the tremendous effect it would have on the traveling public.
The president of United Airlines bought the idea. Like Stimson, he suspected that putting women on planes might encourage men who were still afraid of flying to shed their fears.
Putting women on board helped them tame the image of flight. It brought something kind of domestic or familiar aloft and made flying seem safer, calmer, more serene, more comfortable.
Stimson hired Ellen Church and 7 others under strict height and weight guidelines. They also had to be single. As the marketing-savvy Stimson had predicted, the first stewardesses got enormous publicity.
These girls must be registered nurses, under 24 and up to rigid physical requirements. Take this whirling test. From this, United Airlines doctors can tell what conditions the girls can stand in the air. The pedigree of each girl is carefully noted, and when the tests are finished, her batting average is figured out to the decimal point. 1 ticket for Georgia, and where's the nearest airport?
Independent Woman magazine was soon trumpeting the exciting opportunities for women in the air.
It's open season for women hostesses these days. The airlines have started a vocation for women which tops all others from the standpoint of excitement and romance. There's nothing to it, 24-year-old Eula Neff says. It's just like having your own private plane and all the passengers as your personal guests. The salary, about $100 a month. But don't forget, there's no future except matrimony.
The media may have portrayed it as glamorous, but the reality was different. Even for the newest planes, flying was still a low-altitude, turbulent affair. One of the stewardess's jobs was to help airsick passengers to use paper bags called herb cups. Pilot Ernest K. Gann witnessed firsthand what the stewardess had to go through.
The air is often annoyingly potted with a number of minor vertical disturbances which sicken the passengers. The airplanes smell of disinfectant, feces, and puke. The stewardesses, short-tempered and reeking of vomit, come forward as often as they can for what is a breath of comparatively fresh air.
For passengers who were still interested in eating, the meal invariably consisted of fried chicken. Stewardesses helped carry luggage on board, screw down loose seats, and most importantly, make sure disoriented passengers did not mistake the exit door for the lavatory.
It was hard work, it was physically draining, and it was dangerous. It really was. Between 1930 and 1942, on United Airlines alone, 11 stewardesses were killed. So this was dangerous work.
Betty Hager saw a stewardess ad in the New York Times, and soon she was airborne. For the 23-year-old, the most demanding part of the job was calming terrified passengers. One experience in particular stood out.
As we left Miami, we ran into a terrible storm. I mean, very up and down the way a DC-3 would do. And, you know, hitting the head on the ceiling if you're up walking. So I'm sitting in the back, and the passengers are all turning around, looking at me with fear, paralyzed on their faces, white skin. And that would have been all right. But then a doctor at the middle of the plane suddenly turned around and he says, "We're all going to be killed. What's going to happen? We're all going to be killed." And of course, I could not get up because I'd probably break my neck. And I, as nearly as I could, tried to tell him calmly, and I felt rather calm, really, because I was depended upon by people. I said, "No, we're going to be all right. We're going to be, don't worry about that."
It was a great deal to ask of young women, most in the first job they'd ever had, to handle such high-stress situations. But due to their determination, staffing planes with stewardesses turned out to be a resounding success. The changes, both real and psychological, in how the airlines went about their business had a major impact on how the public viewed flying. And when U.S. Airlines announced in 1940 that they had gone an entire year without a single fatal accident, public confidence received an even greater boost. More and more people began taking the plane instead of the train. Flying had been transformed from a curiosity to a part of the fabric of life. In the history of flight, there have always been the many who view flying as transportation. And there have been the few, like Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who live for their next moment in a plane. In 1941, the man who had loved soaring over the Sahara was miserable, for he was now exiled to New York City. Saint-Exupéry had fled France when the Nazis took over. He came to America hoping to convince the Air Force to give him a fighter to fly against the Germans. But with Saint-Exupéry 10 years older than the approved age for pilots, he was turned down. For 2 long years, he was heartbroken.
My offense is to be living in New York while my people are at war and dying. Why won't they let me climb into a warplane?
Saint-Exupéry consoled himself by writing about a time when he was flying. He began writing and illustrating a new book, The Little Prince, which would become his most famous work. In it, while broken down and lost in the midst of the Sahara, he meets a tiny prince from another world, traveling the universe, trying to understand life.
He asked me, "What is that object?" I said, "It flies. It is my airplane." And I was proud to have him learn that I could fly. He cried out then, "What? You dropped down from the sky?" "Yes." "Oh, that is funny." And the little prince broke into a lovely peal of laughter, which irritated me very much. I like my misfortunes to be taken seriously.
In the book, the little prince discovers the true meaning of life.
And now, here is my secret. A very simple secret. It is only with the heart that one can see truly.
At the end of his conversation with the little prince, the aviator manages to fix his plane, and both he and the little prince continue on their way. In 1944, Saint-Exupéry finally got his wish. He went back to North Africa to fly a warplane for his country. On July 31st, Saint-Exupéry took off on a mission. He never returned. In his life, Saint-Exupéry had seen flying transformed, from biplanes carrying only pilots to sleek metal birds carrying millions of people. It was a transformation brought about by a determined band of visionaries. And in his own way, Saint-Exupéry was one of them, the poet laureate of a time when flight was changed forever.
The Chasing the Sun adventure continues at PBS Online. Relive the romance of the golden age of flying. Trace the evolution of the world's greatest planes. Learn about the real lives of aviation's pioneers. The interactive journey begins at pbs.org.
Next on Chasing the Sun, Frank Whittle, the struggling inventor of the jet engine, tests his machine for the first time.
The speed of the engine increased slowly. Then, with a rising shriek like an air raid siren, the speed began to rise rapidly.
Frank Whittle's engine that changed the world. Next time on Chasing the Sun.
Chasing the Sun was made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of the men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit. The Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. To order a video cassette of this program or the complete 4-part boxed set collection of Chasing the Sun, call 1-800-343-4727 or write to the address on your screen.
This is PBS.